After a very slow period in the 80s, Rollin did start to find his personal voice again. He made a film called Lost in New York in 1989, which was not actually planned to have even been a full movie initially. Kind of echoes what happened with Rape of the Vampire, really. He was contracted to go to America and just get some shots of New York, and then this idea came into his head that he could actually do a bit more with it, and in the end he came out with a movie that's just over an hour in length. Although it's not the nicest looking of movies, it's shot 16mm, it's very grainy, it doesn't have the colour of his earlier films, but it does have a lot of his iconography in there, and it's the beginning of the period where his work became entirely self-referential.
So when I first heard of Jean Rollin's work, it would have been either in the book by David Pyrie or possibly even in Fangoria, because Fangoria did cover his films whenever he made a new film. And most Fangoria audiences were not fans of Jean Rollin's films, because I do remember like letters even, in the letters pages of people like complaining about his crappy films. And, a lot of the horror fans I knew, they almost all hated Jean Rollin's films.
I think it's very difficult to understand what the world, if you were into exploitation cinema or European horror in the late 80s, early 90s. In the UK, there was a lot of censorship, and censorship was an issue. And the films weren't available, but even if you tracked them down, you were essentially breaking the law by bringing them into the country, because they were perceived as other video nasties, or just they weren't classified, or there was no internet, so people found out about new films or discussed new films through horror fanzines, or meeting like-minded people at conventions or things like that. And of course, there were a few films that broke through. Necromantic, German film, very underground film at the time, quite sort of shocking, but nonetheless, that was one of the kind of the must-haves, and the fanzines all talked about it. Now, Rollin was within that world, but he was more obscure. I mean, Rollin was much more even within the genre world, because they were either talking about, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the Exorcist, bigger, more mainstream horror films, or better known directors. People like Franco were pretty obscure. Rollin was even more obscure than Franco.